House Education Policy Committee. It's good to have everybody here. We're going to start the same way we always do, requests for bill introductions. Are there any requests for bill introductions from the committee? Very good. Bill introductions is closed. We're going to jump right in. Today we have a special presentation from the Commissioner Randy Watson of the Kansas State Department of Education. He's going to break down the ESSER funds for us. I did have the pleasure of serving as vice chair of the ESSER task force. It was in charge of sort of validating what KSDE did. So I'm also available to answer questions you have. The two things I wanted to touch on before we get started, just to kind of help you all out for time purposes, the 15 regulations regarding ESSER funds and how they were used, those were designed by the federal government. So it wasn't a state-by-state thing. There's nothing we can do to change those rules. They have to be followed because they're federal regulations. So when you're thinking about questions, just remember this was brought from the feds, and there's really no amendments or changes we can make at the state level. And then also, the private schools got their own set of COVID funding, referred to as EANS. And so the ESSER funds are specifically for public schools. So if you have any questions about private schools, that's probably going to be for another day. So with that, no further questions. Commissioner Watson, thank you for being here. Thank
you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see all of you. Welcome to 2023 and the new session, and thank you for your service. It's really wonderful. We're going to get in the weeds as much as you want to get in the weeds. You have all of the printouts with tabs on a spreadsheet of every school district and the allocation of the funds we're going to go through. And Mr. Chairman, we are going to touch on the EANS funding too and kind of talk about that difference. You know, sometimes I don't like to think back to March of 2020. That was an interesting time, but we're going to kind of go back through that today. So going to try to go over what is known as the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. In education and healthcare and all of our businesses, we acronym everything. And so very quickly, we're going to call this ESSER, ESSER, ESSER. That's just the name of the relief funds as they came from the federal government. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time, maybe. It worked for one slide. So good. I knew they wouldn't give me the clicker for very long. Yeah, quite a bit of time on this slide. Isn't it wonderful? It's very, very nice. Did the whole thing lock up? Okay. Clicker is good. The computer froze. So, but in your packet, if you want to, as she probably reboots, we're going to talk about a chart because that chart you can refer to back. And as I describe things, I think that will make sense. The accompanying slides really describe that chart in detail. So there we go. So this chart. So first of all, to understand, there are three, on the public school side, there are three buckets of money. Two of them came from President Trump's administration, one came from President Biden's administration. So they came over the course of the pandemic. And then there are two buckets of money for the private schools. So I'm going to walk through that. First, we called ESSER 1. That came out almost immediately when the pandemic hit. So I want you to think, because this will kind of inform you of how you think about how school districts spent this money, of what they were going through at the time. So when this money came out, almost every school district in the United States was in a remote environment, as we didn't know about the pandemic. And so we're talking about from March 20 to the end, to Memorial Day of 2020. And in fact, I think every school district in the nation was out of school during that period. In fact, what's interesting as we get into the fall of 2020, we were one of the few states that were open. So this money, $85 million, you're going to see how it was used a little bit later, but it came out and it was given to the states on something that we call in our agency the Title I formula. That will mean nothing to most of you, except that Title I was started by Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s as part of the programs to eradicate poverty. And it's typically reading and mathematics, usually more reading, in high poverty schools. So that formula drives money then to higher poverty schools than lower poverty schools. That's important to know. So on that formula, just as an example, a school district like DeSoto, which has fairly low poverty, didn't receive as much money per pupil as, say, Topeka 501 that has greater poverty. But that's the formula, and we had no say in that formula. That's how they decided to distribute the funds. You need to know that because we distribute the funds as in getting them out to the school districts, but not how that money went out. You'll see a little bit later, the state board did vote to set aside their allocation, which is 9.5% set aside, to go to special ed for several reasons. One, as you know, special ed funding has in a percent has dropped in the last several years, and special ed kids in that period of time were really struggling. How do you teach severely handicapped kids over Zoom? So we were trying to help with a little bit of as much money as we had. Then, in December, right before the Trump administration left, came the second called ESSER 2. Now we're in the school year 2021, about halfway through. More money. Because what they found is, remember, I'm going to remember the good thing. Remember the summer of 2020. Everyone thought, this thing's over, right? We get to summer, it'll clear out, we're going to be fine. Right, Representative Young, you'll remember, we had those conversations, and in fact, that fall was worse. You remember, so then Congress came back and said, we're going to have to allocate more money. We're not out of this pandemic yet. Therefore, they allocated $370 million on the same formula, and the state board then used, again, a chunk of their set aside to go into special ed to help special ed kids. Then when President Biden came in March of 21, the biggest allotment of money, ESSER 3, came in $830 million, and within that, they directly sent to us money for special ed, so the state board didn't even have to allocate it. I also want to point out on this chart, at the very bottom of each of those categories, you can see when the money has to be encumbered. So September 22, meaning ESSER 1 is out the door and spent. You can see ESSER 2 by September 23, so the clock is running on that. And then you can see an ESSER 3 by next September. So that's when the money has to be out the door. I'm sure some of your questions are going to be, we got a lot of money in a short period of time. How do we effectively use that? In fact, I have an interview with the Wall Street Journal tomorrow, and one of the questions they've already said to me is, did this make a difference? And I'm just going to tell you the answer. We don't know yet. We're still evaluating that. I can tell you, I can talk to you about what we saw and what we're starting to see, but it's just a little bit too early to know long term. On the private school side, it's called EANS, Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools. This is fairly unusual because in the Title I formula, if you live in Abilene, for example, there would be part of that formula that would go to the private schools. But in this case, this money is going to go directly to private schools of $27 million. And then EANS 2 came out in March of 21, and that was another, so $27 million and then $25 million. And you can see when that has to be obligated. Now I'm going to go from this point on in a little bit more detail around this slide. But I love this slide because if you take notes or combine, you can always come back, and I think it gives you a good reference to the overall view of this, of when money has to be spent, what it is, how it was allocated. I give our staff all the credit for putting this together. And please stop me at any time. You have questions, Representative Thomas?
Yeah, just to clarify for the committee so everybody's understanding, that money was distributed to the state, but that doesn't mean that it was already given to all the districts. If you want to touch on this, or if it's already part of your plan, I'll be quiet. The application process and all of those things, how we did that with the task force versus just the money comes in and it goes right out. So just for clarification purposes.
So here comes a lot of money in a short period of time, plus we're trying to manage a pandemic. You know, I remember that conversation when we went remote in March of 20, and we did it in 48 hours, and we weren't planning to do that. If you remember, they were canceling the NCAA tournament. I mean, that was happening on Friday, and then everything started to happen. So we were trying to juggle that and all of this, and I talked to our team here and said, and I'm a little worried, we're going to get some money, and this is going to come fast, and school districts are going to need some guidance, and then there's going to be federal auditing that takes place later on when people like Representative Younger are no longer sitting in the seat of superintendent. It will be somebody else, and we got to make sure this money's spent well. And this, Representative Thomas, comes where you really come in. So we established a task force to oversee the department and what we're going to spend. And the task force has done things that were not recommended, and then that recommendation then goes to the state board. This is not required by law. This was something unique to Kansas set up, and again, I want to thank Representative Thomas. He continues, he said he continues to vice chair that and will through September of 24. So it was set up to oversee both the private school side and the public school side. And it includes, as you see, superintendents, legislators are on there, teachers, local school board members, we have business managers, and their private school personnel. We meet by Zoom. It's open to the public. And right now we're meeting once a month right before the state school board. Again, just takes a look. They make recommendations. The state board actually makes the final recommendation, but they provide all of the oversight over EANS 1 and 2. I will tell you that our school districts that border Oklahoma and Missouri in particular, and I only say that because we have very few that border Nebraska and Colorado directly, have complained. Why do we have this? Other states don't have this. Why are we so critical? I want to make sure that they are meeting the law so that when the audit comes later on, as we mentioned, because that'll be in arrears, that they don't have to pay that money back. And so this task force is very important as we go forward. So let's just take a look then of how the state has spent its money in ESSER 1. I'll go through this pretty quick, the slides pretty quick, and then I'll stand for questions, Mr. Chairman. Again, $85 million, 90% of the money came in and went out through the Title I formula on a distribution. We put every penny we had on our set aside to special ed. And that was distributed on the special ed formula. And then we kept a little bit so that these gentlemen could hire some people to start the paperwork that we knew we were going to need to do. That's ESSER 1, and that's all been spent. And you have that printout by district. ESSER 2, 90% went directly to school districts on the Title I formula. This time, we did something a little different. We had more money. And those of you in low poverty school districts were calling me, or texting me, or catching me in the hall. I don't think we could catch each other in the hallway then. All right, and saying, hey, why isn't Blue Valley getting very much money here? Why isn't Andover getting very much money? Well, it was through that Title I formula. So what we did is we did something we called true up. And we said no school district's going to get less than $300 per student. And we were able to do that with our, you see, discretionary money. It allowed us to do that. I don't know if other states did that. But we did because you can't tell me that Kansas City Piper was not affected by the pandemic. They were, and they were getting such little money. So we didn't take anything, say Ulysses or Chapman. We just leveled that up to a base amount. Special ed, another chunk of money over 2 years, $24 million. And then, because the state board oversees the schools for the blind and deaf, and they didn't receive any money, they gave them each $100,000 for the same purposes. ESSER 3, so ESSER 2 is almost about what, 95%, maybe even higher, already out the door. Now we're in ESSER 3. ESSER 3 changed the rules a little bit and a lot more money. Discretionary, here we did the true up to $600 per student We were able to do that. You see, that's the main bulk of that. So if you look at that, 747 million plus 18 million went out to school districts. We had some post-secondary transition to help students that were planning to leave high school during the pandemic. So we put some advisors working with Kansas Board of Regents in our highest minority, highest poverty districts. And then we put aside a little bit of money that still lives on, where Kansas Teachers of the Year are providing training for Kansas teachers, stay in the profession, good training. They travel throughout the state and do that. We also had to set aside in ESSER 3 some money for learning loss, meaning now we have to address the loss of learning that we saw. So here's what the state board did. They said, well, first of all, literacy is extremely important. We purchased training called Letters. Probably don't know about that, but it's about the science of reading. We're spending $15 million to train every pre-K through 3 teacher. And we may be expanding that, in fact, but that's every special ed teacher and pre-service. So professors that are training teachers to go out in the field. That'll be ongoing through September 24. We're also going to be doing mathematics, the science of math, because those are the 2 big areas of academic loss that we saw. Some social emotional training, we call those Kansas CAN competencies, because we saw some mental health issues, and then some competency, that's a total of 29 million. We also enhanced our assessment system so that we could test. I know Representative Estes, you're interested, as many are, in that before grade 3, so we're developing that, and also using a product called FastBridge, which tells you, like, you don't know your sounds of your letters, and we were able to buy that down for districts then to purchase at a much reduced price. And then a little bit more, we had to put aside some for summer learning. So we invested with Boys and Girls Clubs and YMCAs, but you know what, they're wonderful organizations, but you know what you don't find for YMCAs and Boys and Girls Clubs? They tend not to be in rural communities. So we partnered also with 4-H for the same thing. Give us summer programming. We can gather kids, we can go through, and they've done a really good job with that. And then we did something that's just been the most outstanding thing you could have ever thought of, called Sunflower Summer Program. Sometimes you get lucky. You do something that is so widely successful that people say, more and more. Here's what this was, and still is. It will continue through this summer. Any student age 4 through age 18 that hasn't graduated high school, and any adult in their life, can go to over 104 Kansas venues for free. Things like Cosmosphere, an exploration place, and zoos, and park and wildlife, and museums, at no cost. And I can't tell you the amount of email and conversation I've had with people that said, we would not have taken a vacation had this not been available. And what we used were Kansas sites to deliver education that they do in the summer, they do all year, and so that money stayed in Kansas. That's been a tremendous success. All right, allowable uses. I'm going to go through these really quick as you have them. And these are federal, as Representative Thomas said. Here are the uses, and so our staff, in fact, I think they were just looking at a second read. I think they said as we come over on some things, they're going through these uses and how every school district says we want to use them, and they're trying to determine, is that allowable? And then they bring that to the task force, and the task force does the same thing. And sometimes, believe it or not, the task force and our staff don't agree, which is great, because as you know, sometimes it's hard to interpret some of these. So here there were 12 initially. So like you could use it for mental health. So I want to build a baseball stadium because it'll make our kids feel better. So we have to discuss that, right? That's what they want to do, and we have to discuss, does our staff think that's allowable? And then the task force is made up of more lay people to have to determine, is that going to be allowable? And then the state board eventually votes on it. So those are the type of things, and just how it plays out. When we got to When we got to ESSER 2 and then also in ESSER 3, they also added learning loss, facility repairs and improvement, and improve air quality. So you have 15 total that we're looking at. And again, going to go through this pretty quick. When we got to ESSER 3, they said you can spend it on any of those 15. However, 20% of that new money in ESSER 3 has to be spent on kids that lost during the pandemic. And you can see academic loss, evidence-based programming, social, emotional needs, but they had to lose, and you had to work with those subgroups. Also in ESSER 3, you had to consult with a lot of different groups on how you're going to spend that money. And I would say between the learning loss, and our staff may correct me, and this requirement, school districts were like, well, we don't have any civil rights groups in Nest City. Well, you need to reach out to some. Or we don't have any tribes in our community. Well, you still need to reach out. That was a different requirement than in 1 and 2. And that, I would say, that in conjunction with the learning loss is probably what's slowed down the ESSER 3 coming forward. So let's just look how they spent money. You have the spreadsheet so you can look at your school districts of how they spent their money in those 15 categories. I'm going to just show you as a state how we spent it. The gold or the yellow will be what we call kind of learning loss, and the blue will be more what we call technology, or you can see sanitation. Here's ESSER 1. I want to point out to you the 2 major categories off the bat. What do you think school districts did? They bought laptops, they bought iPads, they bought technology to go remote, and they bought sanitation equipment to clean their buildings. And that's what you would think, right? During that time period, that's what they would do with it. Then we get to ESSER 2. Now, premium pay drops up the top. Representative Estes, do you remember? Randy, can't we spend this on bonuses? And our staff are going, we can't spend it on, it's right in the law, you can't spend it on a bonus. And I know you were saying, hey, we need to pay some teachers all this work that they're doing extra. And then the federal government said, you cannot do it on a bonus, but we'll allow you to do premium pay. The layperson says to me, that's a bonus, but they'll shoot me for saying that. And so you'll see now premium pay and learning loss is toward the top of the second round. And you can also see over at the far right, that little blue sliver of 1% is all we have left to spend statewide in ESSER 2. Here's ESSER 3. Premium pay remains. So they're paying bonuses to teachers to come back. They're paying for people to do summer school, after school. Teachers are doing without planning periods. A lot of different things they're paying extra for teachers. Learning loss. And the third category you see in ESSER 3 is indoor air quality. You're also going to see a lot of money going to replacing HVAC systems that were old and antiquated that allowed school districts then to have a better air quality movement. Here is the private school, and then yes.
All right, we're moving into the private school, so I think we should probably stop and check for questions regarding the ESSERs. That way we can just kind of keep it all separated.
Great.
Any questions from the committee? Representative Estes?
I think we coined the term additional pay for additional duties, and that is not a bonus.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. That's in the record right now. Thank you. Yeah, but you were really good at trying to get that money to the teaching staff, and that's really helped us keep staff and give and help keep that during this time.
See no other questions. I have one. The letters, the science of reading. I know that money was covered through ESSER. Is that considered a pilot program that you guys plan on? You want to keep going?
It's a training program.
Okay, got it.
So we're trying to do all this training within that 3-year period. And what we did on math, we developed the modules ourselves so that can live on. But that letters is a company-owned science of reading program. So we're trying to provide that training within that 3-year period. And it looks like we're going to be able, I said pre-K3, to actually expand that through 6th grade and administrators. And so we're working as hard as we can to get all those people trained. And that's hard because of time and substitute teachers.
Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Dr. Watson. I have a question related to carryover balance, because I'm not familiar with this, and I understand there's a deadline that has to be distributed, the amount, but how much of that money, perhaps budgeted for premium pay, can be carried over to the next year, or does it have to be spent by the end of that year?
It has to be spent by the end of the period of time that that certain category has to be spent. So ESSER 1 has to have been spent.
Okay, and so then what's the assurances that districts give to make sure that the money is spent, and what's their response been as far as reporting back the funds, and how's that been?
I'm going to turn around and look. It's been good.
Yeah, and there.
Come on up, Dean. Might
Yeah,
introduce yourself.
excellent question. So Dean Zeitz, Assistant Director on the Special Education and Title Services team. And as we transition now into 2023, we've got under our belts at least 2 years now of reporting data. And the requirements and the depth of reporting that is required by the U.S. Department of Education, as well as Congress and other oversight organizations, has become much richer during that time. Currently, the districts are in the process of submitting their annual report for this year that will be submitted in May, but it includes everything from breakdowns, much of it actually based on some of the stuff that Kansas did, because we actually worked with the U.S. Department of Ed. They borrowed a lot from our breakouts and forms of reporting, but breaking out into different topics, categories related to different types of after-school services, before and out-of-school services, infrastructure, et cetera.
Just to follow up on that, how it worked as far as the funds go is the districts would have to submit their plan and lay out every dollar spent, where it went, those premium pays, who it went to, and all of that. Then it would have to get approved, and then the task force would look at it and say, does this follow the rules of the ESSER fund? So all of those plans were submitted, sometimes 900, 950 pages in 1 month we would go through, and each district would have their plan submitted, and then we would go through them and say, does this fall into those categories? So they had to be specific to every dollar and every cent before they were considered. And sometimes we had to send them back and say, you used the word bonus, can't do that. So.
And then they had to spend the money, and then we sent it out to them. So that's the other part. And if they change their mind, then we have a change order that has to still go through the same process. Thank you.
Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think this happened with the same funds with the county commissioners in the city, that they had to do, I think it's called a Class 1 audit, which of government funds. Is that anything that the school
No, this
had to do?
we're trying to do this accountability with it, but this would be a federal audit that actually would come in.
Right.
So
I think that's exactly what they're looking at.
I'm not familiar with that term, so Dean may be.
Yeah. The terminology is a little bit different with the education programs, but any entity that that expended at least $750,000 has to have a federal single audit, and they are receiving those.
Single audit.
Yeah.
That's what I was looking for. Okay, thank you. And so is that already set up in, you have those people on staff already to do that kind of audit? Or, because that's a very expensive audit to do that. And so is that at the school, the state school board level, or where's that being done at?
Great question. It is done by at the district level. And this requirement predated COVID. It's just that more districts are having to do it because of the influx of additional federal funds. It is the local district that actually procures the CPA services, the accountant services that are qualified to do this. However, they are explicitly allowed to use a portion of their federal funds, their ESSER funds, to pay for that, because you're right, they can get expensive for the larger ones.
Yeah, typically they're like 3 times more expensive than their normal audit. So you have a school board that, I mean, I use the example, let's say Wellington, Kansas. They've not had to do that because they've been before that level. So where are they going to use these funds, hopefully, to be part of that money to pay for that audit? And in the case of my example, Wellington, Kansas, the person that had in the past done that CPA audit for them is not doing that anymore. So now they have to reach out to Wichita, more expensive, more travel, all that kind of stuff. So this is a big use of those funds that they weren't ready for kind of thing. So thank you.
Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Chair. Just a follow-up question so I can understand it. The process that you described as far as the school submitting the plan, and then they will get, in essence, reimbursed for the expenditures for that to demonstrate that. Is that something that the state of Kansas and your task force defined, or was that the federal?
Is that federal, or did we define? Federal.
Federal. So, okay. And then how many of the districts that submit a plan made it to the task force, but then did not get accepted even after they clarified or?
Zero.
Okay.
Eventually, they all worked their way through. Now, we're still working through ESSER $3, but through 1 and 2, all eventually got there. They may have made a run at it several times, but they all got there. Very good question.
Any other questions before we move on? Any questions from our WebEx participants? I apologize, I hadn't asked yet. Very good.
Okay.
Continue.
So now we're going to talk about EANS, which is somewhat the same and then different. But in theory, it's to go to the private schools for the same type of purposes to help with pandemic. There are 2 buckets. So when ESSER 1 came out, there was no private companion to that. That happened when ESSER 2 came out and ESSER 3, there was a private companion called EANS. So EANS 1 came out, has to be spent or awarded by 23. It's 26.7 million. Here's what caused us a lot of strain, just from a procedural. This money, we had 30 days to launch the application process and 30 days to respond then to the applications. So we had to set aside all the ESSER plans and do this and get it out the door. I mean, it was really, really fast. And you could reimburse for some expenses that they had already done from March of 20. When we get to EANS 2, you couldn't reimburse, so that stopped. And again, we had 30 days. So there's the 2 chunks of money. I'm just going to go through, there's some differences here, and then I'll turn over and answer any questions. First of all, here's the average now per pupil expenditure that has gone out the door. So ESSER 1 average was $168 per pupil across Kansas. The ESSER 1 sped was 18. You can see I'm not going to go through all the dollars. When you do that on per pupil basis, the private schools receive more money per pupil than the public school. That's just a matter of math and the way it worked. Also, as you'll see here, there were some stipulations to the private schools that they may have received money earlier through some other programming, which then disallowed them to have also this money. But again, as you talk to your constituents and they say, well, you know, public school got a lot of money, and they did. But when you look at it per pupil, the private schools actually received more. Now, this is private accredited schools. It's not homeschool. It's not and they had to be in existence prior to the pandemic. So they couldn't, oh, we just started a school, now we want the money. And that's just part of the law. So eligibility to participate, I'm not going to go, you have to be, here's a not-for-profit school, you had to be accredited, licensed within the state, you had to exist prior to the pandemic, and you could not have participated in the Small Business Administrators Payback Protection Program, or PPP. And many school districts, private, did in the early stages, which made them ineligible for this money per federal government. So as you talk to your private school, they may say that to you. 72 private school requested 26.9 million. Of that, 21.6 were eligible, and you can see there how they spent their money. They cannot, the private schools have to get that in the terms of services. So because they can't keep it. So if you buy a computer with this money on the private school, at the end of the period of time, it comes out. So you see what they've done here is hired personnel temporarily, or they purchased curriculum resources, or they sanitize things. You can see how they spent and their money in 5 categories. In ESSER 2, we had the same requirements, except the federal government said, you need to distribute this money to low-income private schools. What's low income? 40% or greater low income, free and reduced lunch. You know how many private schools in Kansas have 40% poverty? Not quite zero, but pretty close. So we're looking at this going, we're not gonna be able to give this money out. So here's something I'm really proud of that our staff did. They went to the federal government and said, listen, you gotta drop that. And they allowed Kansas to go down to 20%, or we would have had a difficult time giving very much of this money out. So still though, you had to have 20% poverty, and a number of our private schools, of those 72 that did the first round, just simply could not meet that criteria. They just didn't have that much poverty. So now we only had 26 schools apply for a total of 15.7 million. See how that you get your per pupil cost fairly high. In that, about 12.7 were deemed eligible, and then that funding flowed. Any money left went back to the gear fund of the governor's office. She allowed us through the education department, the federal government, to keep some of that money that went primarily for Sunflower Summer expansion. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll be happy to answer any questions around that or anything else. Again, you have the spreadsheets for every individual school district on each of those funds. And so you can look over that and always call us if you have any questions about how they're spending that money.
Questions from the committee or from the WebEx members?
I have one.
Representative Gens.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Could you comment to the discrepancy of amount per pupil towards normal students and the special ed students, and just why did it happen that way? It's personal to me. My son has Down syndrome. Just wondered why, 168, 761, 1,700, and 53 and 18. Where did the math come from for that? What was the rationale behind that?
Question, Representative Getz. So the federal government said to us, you have to distribute that 90% of those funds to school districts on the Title I formula, which is a poverty-based formula. So that's how it got distributed. So in those districts that have a low per pupil, that's because they have low poverty. So special ed wasn't part of that. We put some money into special ed to help with that, but it was not very much because we didn't have very much set aside. However, that money could be spent on special ed kids, but it went toward the poverty formula. As I went through that, you'll remember in ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, that dollar amount was so low in our low poverty public schools, we raised that floor to $300 a student and then $600. So you couldn't get any less than that, or we would have districts even with a greater spread. Is that helpful?
Refresh my memory. On ESSER 3, I believe you got a set amount for special ed. Was it ESSER 1 that you guys decided to give money to special ed and ESSER 2?
ESSER 2.
Right, okay.
The federal government then set money, not in the 40% we may want to argue about that, but they sent it within the ESSER 3 and said, spend this in special ed. So, but all those are remember, all this is one-time money. And the question I get is, what's going to happen when all this money leaves? And that question was asked of our staff. Well, we have staff members that will only work through this period of time, and then they won't be employed in that capacity.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that I'm pretty sure the board decided to contribute that money in ESSER 1 and 2, so there was no federal funding in ESSER 1 or 2 allocated for special ed. That was something Kansas did on their own. So
that's correct. But again, any of the money can be spent on any student, including special ed students. We just did that.
Representative Featherston?
Okay, I found question 1. Here's question 2. Do you know the connection between special ed families and how they fall into Title I? Like, is there a higher propensity of special ed that falls in Title I, or no correlation? Okay.
If they don't know, I certainly don't.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions from the committee? Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And once again, thanks, Dr. Watson, for the presentation. And so 2 questions, and I'm not sure if I'm going too deep in the weeds on this one, so it's fine if we want to do a follow-up on it. But in reference to the IDEA fund, in which the funding is set aside to also help private schools serve their special education students, did any money cross over to that? Or maybe more specifically, how much of the public funding actually also supported private schools?
Great question. So in ESSER 1, that title formula to the private schools is what held.
Okay.
In ESSER 2 and 3, 0, because they had a separate fund of money.
Thank you very much. And then I just want to compliment you on the Sunflower Summer. I took advantage of that myself, and it was a wonderful program. And I'm just curious, you started off with like, you know, you don't know yet the results, but it seems like you're pretty excited about that Sunflower Summer. Is that going to continue? And if so, what other things have you learned through this that, man, this really worked out better? Because in my opinion, 30 days to roll out an application and then 30 days to respond, that's some efficiency that I'm glad when I worked at the KSDE, I didn't have to deal with that, so.
Well, I'm blessed with, by the way, I don't know if you heard when Dean came up, he did not introduce himself as in charge of ESSER or EANS. This was not something, these additional duties as assigned. All of you know that, right? In any business that you run, and they've been outstanding. Sunflower Summer will go for 1 more year. So the state board just voted this week. We had X amount of dollars, and they were deciding, do we want it in 23 and run it in 24 and try to shrink it? They said, no, we just want to open it. It'll be open from Memorial Day to early August, and 104 venues and wildlife, and we keep building it. I will say this, it's been so successful, you may want to consider working with Commerce and travel and tour. I mean, here's federal money going to Kansas families in learning activities, and the money goes directly back to Kansas venues to educate them. And then people have taken advantage of that to so much. And you don't have to be in a public school. You don't have to be in a private school. You can be homeschooled. Any student age 4 to age 18 that hasn't graduated high school can take any adult, mom, dad, a neighbor, or someone they go to church with. And so our money will run out this summer, at the end of August. But that's a little bit of money we think that's been just a wonderful thing for families and the economy.
Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late today. So if this has been already answered, I'll catch you afterwards. But I came in when you were talking about reading, which is a high priority for me, and letters training. So what is the department doing with Board of Regents schools or with universities to incorporate the science of reading instruction when they're training new teachers?
Yeah, very important. So that money goes to the university professors that are training teachers, for them to go through the training, and then for any student that's currently in college right now to go through it if they want to. And that's true on the public and the private side, in professor. So we're trying to train the whole state in 3 years.
Representative Estes.
The previous representative had the same line of thought that I had on that, because what I'm wanting to know, and I think he's kind of asked it, are we making sure that the universities are going to use that model, not making sure, working with them, that they're going to keep using that model forward so that as new teachers come out, we don't have a gap of people? Are they adopting it?
They must.
Okay.
And so Representative Schreiber will know we had a dyslexia task force that was a joint effort. It's being discussed in Senate Ed as we speak. And those requirements live on forever. What we were able to do here is infuse money for the training. But the requirement is there. You know, it's one, my mother went through breast cancer in the mid-1990s. My sister went through just a year ago. Did fine. The difference in technology between the mid-1990s and 2022 was unbelievable. The difference of what we know about reading from 1995 to today is undisputable. We didn't know as much in 95. We didn't have the research base to know it. We now know that a kid that can't put together a letter sound simple, like apple, will struggle. Some kids it naturally comes to and others do not. And that's why we're totally invested for the long term, Representative Estes, and in the short term in training everyone with this money.
For the record, I was in 6th grade in 1995, but that's okay. We don't need to talk about that.
Representative Haskins asked me, what other things have you learned? Mental health needs went up dramatically with adolescents. Teachers got tired in a hurry. You know, even as we came out of the pandemic, I mentioned we were in school when a lot of other states were out, but county health would close schools and we were in and out. And then even last year when we were all in and we weren't really in and out, I think Representative Younger would echo this. And you go into schools and our teachers were just exhausted. You just could see it. This year's much different. There's just a different feeling when I'm out in schools. But last year was still exhausted. So one of the things we learned mental health, we learned exhaustion, and academic performance dropped off like a cliff. And so people are saying, how long will that take to recover? I don't know. That's the honest truth. We're starting to see a recovery. How long will we, but I don't know. We'll get better data when we get to this spring. But that's what we're trying to help kids do. Post-secondary attainment, especially four-year degree. So four-year degree, that dropped off significantly in 20 and 21. Young people going to college just really dropped too.
Well, and I think it would be somewhat irresponsible to say, oh, we'll get it fixed in the next 2 years. I think it's good that you're telling us, listen, you can't put a date on it. We don't know. Time will tell. We got to keep looking at the results. And I agree with you on that. Representative Schmoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As far as the audit side goes, when we're looking at how these funds were actually used, what does it look like if a district mismanaged or falsified something as far as that goes?
Said they're going to do this, but they really didn't,
Right.
and the audit points that out. I would say they run the risk of having to send the money back. And by the way, the money's already been spent, so think about what that'll do to a budget. That's one of the reasons we have this task force, because we knew over a 4-year period how many principals and superintendents and school boards would change over that passed the plan and executed it, versus now they're living with the consequences of having, to spend it or not spend it. We get that sometimes with an election that went wrong and money has to come back, or someone's challenged a tax and it goes on for 2 or 3 years. And if you didn't put back that money, it can really create havoc. So we hope we've done our due diligence that doesn't happen in any school district.
As far as that goes, would that be a state issue that is conducting the audit and ensuring, and then they're going to be accountable to the state, to the task force? Or is that they're accountable to the federal government?
They're accountable to the federal government.
Perfect.
It's
Thank
their
you.
money.
Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kansas is one of the few states that actually funds special education for gifted students.
Yes, sir.
And so do you have any numbers anywhere of how much of that special ed extra funding actually might have gone to the gifted programs around the state?
Through the federal relief money?
Yes.
I don't think we do. I don't think we tracked it that way. That's a great question. We are. That's something I don't think most people know. That is not in the federal law, but it is in the Kansas statute.
Representative Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Watson. The $128 million that has not been distributed yet, is that money, are there applications for that money in the pipeline, or are you still accepting applications? Or
The deadline for that was mid-December, and so we're working through about 85 or so applications that we hope to get first approval, meaning out the door initially without change request, in February and March.
Thank you.
And then there'll be change requests for the next 2 years as people say, oh, yeah, that money should be going out the door.
Representative Haskins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if we are going to address this at another meeting, that's fine, but we were given information on vacancy, faculty or teacher vacancy in the state, and it does seem like you have a pretty good case study as far as if we add more money into these premium areas that we can learn from that. What can you tell us about the actions that are being done to build up our teachers and keep them within our schools?
Ruined the surprise.
Great segue, Representative
Great,
Haskins.
perfect segue.
Great segue.
If we want to
Representative
touch
Stock-
on that now, we can. Real quick, before we get to this, are there any other questions on the ESSER or the EANS before we dive into this? Perfect.
Representative Stockstill and I had a conversation, and I know that, Mr. Chairman, we did too, about teacher shortage. We made this as big as we could. You have it electronically. You can blow it up on your screen. This is just the raw number of teacher shortages we had this fall in Kansas. Raw number. So where's the largest number going to be? Wichita. Wichita has by far the most kids and most teachers. So just the raw number. So if you look at like Chase County, which is Chase County Schools, that they didn't have any vacancies. So you can see the number. What you don't see here that I can get for you is, what are they in? The answer is yes. They're in everything. In my career, I was superintendent at McPherson for many years through 2015. I can tell you, for most of that time, we never advertised for an elementary teacher. I had 100 applicants on file. PE, social studies, we didn't advertise. By the time I left, that was starting to shrink a little bit. And now I can tell you, we just recognized Mike Augerbright, the Kansas Superintendent of the Year yesterday, Superintendent of South Lyon County. He said, we have 2 openings right now. We have 0 applicants for those openings. So one of the challenges, and one of the things we saw in COVID, is if you hit Caper's retirement, which for a teacher that started right after college, that's going to be about age 54. When you look around the state, come the fall of 23, look and see how many superintendents are 55 years or older. Look how many principals you see that are 55 years or older, and look how many veteran teachers are going to be 55 or older, and you will be shocked at that number, meaning not very many. That was our quality baby boomers and Gen Xers that have left the system. And so we not only have a number shortage, we have a quality shortage. And that concerns all of us because that is how we're going to drive this learning loss recovery. You got to have really good teachers. So part of this training that we're trying to do, and Representative Younger has heard me say that, we have to try to figure out how to help the years of experience that people like him would have had, that we have now young people that have ascendancy to leadership and teaching positions very quickly, and how do we help simulate those years of experience they just don't have so that our kids can benefit from that. So it's complex of how we do it. We look at licensure requirements all the time. Does that help? Things we can do. We've been talking about interstate compacts or ways we can look at it. But as you know, Representative Thomas, I know you this, go to any industry today and ask them if they need employees. I don't care if it's engineering, healthcare, restaurant, everyone needs employees. We have a great low unemployment, and when that happens, and you're in the public sector, so teachers, they're looking at that going, man, I don't know, I can make a lot more money here, and there's a high demand here, and so that hurts. You know, if we were in a mass recession and there were layoffs going on, people tend to go into more firefighters, police, and teachers during that time. So here's the shortage. I'll stop there. You have the map. I'd be happy to try to answer the detailed questions around, you know, the pockets of where they're at. But the shortage is everywhere. It used to be math, science, and special ed. But it's everywhere. It's elementary. I never thought I'd say we have a shortage of elementary teachers, but we do.
I have a quick question, and I'll get to the committee. Is the state board considering, I know once you retire as a teacher, a lot of the questions I get from retirees is, I can get back in, but there's a certain amount of time I can't get back in because of capers and all of that. So they have to wait, I don't know, I think it might be like 6 months before they can start subbing. I understand the thought process of you're getting capers and you'd sort of be dipping back into that, but I wonder with these kind of numbers, is that something, and is that something the state board is considering looking at or rescinding or?
So, great question. Just let me tell you what the parameters are. If you're younger than 62 and you retire, and again, if you started at age 21, that's about 54, so that gives you that range. You must set out 6 months before you can return to a capers position. If you're older than 62, you must wait 60 days. Okay? The state board would love to change that. That is your purview. And I will tell you, because former Representative Johnson worked along on that capers bill, the IRS is the one that said you're going to need a separation of service. So there's nothing the state board can do. That would be a legislative action in conjunction with the capers board. And I think it's difficult because the IRS says if you don't have a separation, I'm way out in front of my skis because I don't run capers. You don't have a retirement plan, you have a savings plan, and therefore the benefits of taxes are changed. Now, Alan Conroy could answer that question much better than I could. So, but yes, we hear that all the time. I'd come back, but you make me set out 6 months, and I'd certainly help sub. So what the state board has done is relax some of the sub requirements to get, and thank you, because you helped us and did that for 3 months. That will expire at the end of May. That was a temporary, and I think we had about 1,000 people do that, which was, I went to a school district, so I went to the Emporia School District. They said, I'll hire you even though you don't have a degree, but I'll verify, I've watched you teach, you'll be a great sub. We licensed them just for the Emporia School District. And we got about 1,000 people in the pipeline to help out there. So, but that expires at the end of May.
I've got Representative Schreiber and then Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Watson, so looking at these numbers, I'm naturally drawn to Southwest Kansas because that's where I grew up. So Finney, Seward County, and Ford County all show very high teacher vacancies. Is it because of the student population is growing and there's not enough teachers for that, or are the teachers leaving and the student population has basically stayed the same? Do you know?
I can tell you that generally in Kansas, people like to live east of Interstate 135. And we've migrated that way. So even when we're fully, when I was studying in McPherson doing fine, Garden City was struggling. This just made it harder. So it just made it harder. And so, and Representative Younger can tell you from Ulysses, he always had a shortage, and this just made it even more. It expanded the fields, it expanded the numbers. And so I can just tell you, we're working with the Kansas Board of Regents to try to figure out how to have some lower cost programs where we could keep Western Kansas families and people and get them. So money's an issue. I can't go to college. I don't have the money, and I can't work full time. So how could we maybe hire someone to work in schools, go to night school, go to summer school, and then scale that up? We're looking at programs that we think especially would be of help to Western Kansas and rural, really all rural, but especially Western Kansas, some in the southeast.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I want to make sure I'm understanding this. Is this a projection because it says 2023 fall, which we haven't gotten to yet, or is this actual numbers for the current school year?
This is numbers as of the fall of this school year.
So it's
we started
really
school and they reported these
2022
numbers.
then?
Yes.
It should be, okay. Then my next question is, so there's been an out-migration of teachers. Do you find any trends in particular? Why are people leaving the teaching profession?
Thank you, Representative Sanders. So let me say two things around that. There is a misconception started several years ago by a billboard on I-70 between here and Kansas City saying, come to Missouri to teach, that we export teachers to Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma. We import more than we export, and that continues to be true. So just from an import, export, we bring in more from Missouri than we send to Missouri, Oklahoma, et cetera. Where we see the exodus is, I'm not going to any state, see ya. I'm not just gonna work. My wife did that. Came home at spring break, she was an elementary principal, 20 years, been an elementary teacher, and said, I'm done. I can't do this. Exhaustion. Now, I'm going to speculate because the pandemic changed relationships, and it changed relationships in communities. And I think people that were in their 50s or 60s said, this is a new environment. It's really hard. It's always been hard. And they've just left. There's a sense, right or wrong, that they often feel unappreciated, and they're not wanting to sub. They're not wanting to come back in another capacity. They've just left the profession. They retired, taken their retirement, and left.
We're not paying tariffs to Missouri on those imports and exports, are we?
No, we are not.
Okay, just checking.
As someone that grew up on the Oklahoma border, we are not. But Coffeyville, 20% of their workforce and teaching comes from Oklahoma, sitting on the border.
Representative Stogsdill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've talked to a lot of teachers, and I taught back in, well, before DIRT, and it was just a completely different environment as far as teaching went. It was much more teacher-oriented. It was much more hands-on with kids, that sort of thing, and it was a great system. I'm just wondering, and the teachers that I talk to now are saying, yeah, part of it's money, but a lot of it is that I'm just hearing, we don't even have time to teach. There's so much testing, there's so much paperwork, there's so much this and that, interaction with parents, or you having to, what they consider to be a lack of administrative support, that sort of thing. Is there task force or anybody looked at those sorts of issues, and is that part of what's driving? I would think that would be even a large part of what's driving a lot of teachers out of the profession.
Representative Stockstill, yes, and both KBOR and us are working jointly on that. We have shrunk from our standpoint the state assessment time frame, but there's lots of testing that districts do on their own. We're trying to streamline that. We want to know. So I say this: if I go to my doctor and he's concerned about my heart health, one of the tests that, as you know, run is a cholesterol test. What's your cholesterol? But they tend to run one test unless it's off. They don't run 5. So we need to know, again, I'll come back, that letter sound in kindergarten, first apple. How many times do we need to test that? That was the question. So we're trying to streamline that testing, make sure it's appropriate, and help districts not only shrink the testing, but use tests that are free versus paid, so we can use that money somewhere else to help support staff. And you also hear shortage of special ed, as others have noted. We have a terrific shortage of paras which serve those special ed kids, and that puts more burden than on special ed teachers also.
I had one more quick question. On the paras and stuff, I can understand that because that probably pretty much parallels teachers. How about other classified classified personnel? I assume we're having the same problems there.
Well, you know, we joked a little bit, but any of you that have a teaching license or would like one that is eligible, we could get you a substitute. If you want to drive a bus, we really need bus drivers. Can't find bus drivers, and are having trouble finding food service workers. So it's across the board. But my friends that are in business tell me, I can't find construction workers. And so it's a good problem to have when unemployment's low. But it's hard when, you know, we're trying to run a system and really trying to make an impact on kids, and our veterans aren't around as much as they used to be.
Yeah. Thank you.
Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there any kind of recommendation from the State Board of Ed or out of your office relative to cell phones in classrooms? There seems to be a wide variety of policies in various schools about whether cell phone usage in classrooms is allowed. I believe I've understand that the Blue Valley School District, they get to hold on to their cell phones, but they have to put it in some sort of a special bag when they come into the classroom, and that basically they can't use it while it's in that sack. What's the general consensus, if there is one, on cell phones in classes?
So that is a local determined item, so every school district would determine that. I've been in districts where, as they come in, they put it actually in a lockbox and it stays there. But I want to give you an example where this kind of falls apart at the local level, because I had a parent call whose daughter was being bullied today, and we went through it. And I said, well, the bullying was taking place in social media and over the phone, and it's hard. And I said, well, have you thought about, this was a sixth grader, have you thought about taking the phone from her? Well, it's not her fault. I said, yeah, I know, but it stops. It goes away, right? So we're starting to see really emerging research. So I was just having this conversation literally before I came over. Really emerging research that when I go into Dillon's or Walmart and I see a young infant in a stroller with an iPad, it just drives me crazy. I told my daughter, I have a 2-year-old granddaughter, I said, if I see that, I said, I want her flopping on the floor mad that you didn't buy her the candy, because they'll be quiet. But that interaction, we're starting to see emerging research that that's not good. We're also starting to see emerging research. You may not remember a movie that George Lucas made pre-Star Wars, but I do. It's called American Graffiti. And I used to use a clip of that, because if you were an adolescent in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, or mid-90s, we all had a common experience. We cruised Main Street. The cars changed, but American Graffiti, right? If you remember, Richard Dreyfuss looks at the Susanna, she said she loved me, right? There's this need to be wanted. There's this fight goes on. That transpires on here now. And kids are looking at their TikToks and how much was this liked, and we're seeing mental health with adolescents, especially middle school, really go up, Representative Sanders. And so unintended consequences, this is a great device. We all have them. You know, we know as much as a meteorologist, right? Whenever it's going to happen, we have great instant, but it's doing things to young people. And by the way, it's doing things to adults where we don't have these conversations as much anymore. So we have to look at that. I think we're going to have to really study what the research is really emerging on this as it relates to unintended consequences of the technology.
Representative Featherston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know this is off topic of the ESSER, but since I represent Blue Valley, their stated policy, students may bring their own devices, will be responsible for the care and technical support. The district does not provide technical support for personal devices. In bold, students will use any personal mobile devices only at appropriate times throughout the school day and adhere to all classroom expectations.
The school districts that I've talked to that have kind of taken the cell phones, they say the kids are okay, the parents really, how am I going to get a hold of my kid? Well, Representative Stockstill, in a different area, you called the office and said, I really need to talk to my kid. Can you go get him? We can still do that, by the way. Back in those days, too, they made you go to the payphone to call after practice. The emerging research is not good with adolescents and the use of that. So we're going to have to really look at that.
All right, we got time for a couple more questions, if there are any. I know Representative Haskins, if you'd like to chime in here, that would be great.
Thank you. I feel like I'm monopolizing new.
Not at all.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But I'm just curious, you know, you sworn in some new board members, and what's on the agenda for KSDE this next coming year? How are things looking, and how was your first meeting?
So I know, because Representative Hubert chaired this committee, so you have different membership, some the same and some different on this committee. anytime you have a group and you infuse any new, you change culture. And so we've changed culture. And so I think, first of all, we have 3 new people on the state board, and they haven't been there for any of the ESSER funds, right, or any of the EANs. We have to get them caught up to speed. So we're spending the first part just kind of catching people up with that. The challenges are this. We are dedicated to the science of reading, mathematics, and reversing the academic trends that we're seeing. We're highly dedicated to that. We also know that the kids that are performing at the very top academically still aren't going on to post-secondary in the numbers our researchers would say that they should, if academics alone, which tell us there's some employability skills that business said we need to work on too, and we're committed to doing that. So you'll see some goals coming out, some 2-year goals, but we're committed to 95% graduation, 70% kids earning something beyond high school, and I want you to know this. You ought to be proud of that. We have more skilled labor coming out of our schools today, plumbers, electricians, CNAs, 8% more than we did just a few years ago. So Representative Haskins, we're going to be bringing them together and setting some new goals.
Great way to end the committee on such a high note there. So that was awesome. Well, thank you, Commissioner Watson, for taking 10 minutes out of your day to come and talk to us.
As always.
Tate's good to see you. Thank you for coming. You're a man of few words, and we appreciate that. This was a great discussion, and I know as we talk about the relationship between the state board and the legislature, I think this was an amazing start to sort of start conversations, and like you're doing with the new board members, get everybody, especially new board members, up to date as far as ESSER funds and what's going on with that. So thank you very much for coming. This was very informative, so thank you. If there's nothing further for the good of the committee, then I will declare us adjourned. We are not meeting, sorry, real quick. We are not meeting tomorrow, obviously, because it's Friday. Monday, there's no session. And then Tuesday, as of now, we are not meeting. Our next meeting will be Wednesday, the 18th, and we will have Deputy Commissioner Craig Neuenswinder give us a presentation on K-12 by the numbers. And then on Thursday, if you'll pull up House Bill 2003 and start reading through that, we're going to have a hearing on that. So that is next week so far in a nutshell, okay? So with that, we are adjourned.